Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I know this is an unusual time to have a session, but I'm especially delighted to see so many of the members of Dean Rostow's in my class. Dean, thank you for joining us here. I often say at the beginning of these introductions what a personal pleasure it is to introduce our guest, but there are a few who come more especially into that category for me than Dennis. We've done and spent a lot of time together over the years in some of the most unusual and kind of hard to describe set of circumstances, although I have to say I've spent all kinds of time with Dennis on airplanes, in airports, in prime ministers' offices, in places. But the most important time I've spent with Dennis is not with Dennis, because the most important time I've spent is waiting for Dennis to come out of his meetings with Assad. When we were doing the negotiations with the Syrians, President Assad has a wonderful style, which Dennis can describe in much more excruciating detail, since I only heard about it secondhand. But we would arrive in Damascus and we would go to the Sheraton Hotel and wait to be summoned. But the meetings were very private, and usually they were meetings involving only Dennis and Secretary Christopher. And so the rest of Secretary Christopher's entourage would sit at the Damascus Sheraton, right. And the problem was that normally these meetings would go on for 4, 5, 6 hours, right? But you never knew for sure. And sometimes if things didn't go well, they would go on for 4, 5, or 6 minutes. But you had to be ready to go, because you didn't stay in Damascus. That was one of the rules of the game. And so you arrived in time for the meeting. You sat there waiting for the either brown or blue or white smoke to come up from the top of the hill, and then you'd get the word from the diplomatic security folks that they were on their way back, grab your bags, and were heading for the airport. So my most vivid memories of Dennis are just waiting for Dennis, somewhat like waiting for Godot. But Dennis Ross has had an extraordinary career, and we talk about public service here a lot. It's hard to imagine somebody who has given more to his country or to the ideals that he believes in than Dennis. He has worked in. I meant to ask you, did you actually make it into this administration? Or no, okay. So I was going to say in every administration since Reagan, but I guess this is not the case. I thought you might have had a couple of days of overlap. But he began his career first in the Reagan administration, right? And
actually first in the Carter administration.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You were there too.
Defense Department.
Yeah, so we both got our start in the same place.
Yeah.
I was doing different things in those days. But he has played an important role in each of these presidencies. As I told the class the other day when we were previewing your visit, when Dennis worked with Secretary Baker on pulling together the coalition in Iraq, he was the only person in the government who could genuinely claim to be an expert in both of the important foreign policy dimensions, which is the Middle East and the Soviet Union. And getting the Russians to be part of the coalition. So he played a unique role in that, in German unification, in the whole end of the Soviet Union, because of his expertise in Soviet matters, but also his unparalleled and unprecedented depth of knowledge and experience in the Middle East, which has served so many presidents so well. And it's been encapsulated both in the book he's going to talk about today, Statecraft, but also his prior book about the Middle East peace process, which, albeit long, is really an indispensable account of the negotiations, and really anybody who's seriously interested in both the history and the challenges ahead, I highly recommend it to them. So without further ado, I give you Ambassador Dennis Ross.
It's nice to be here, in no small part because of Jim, who you're all lucky to have, because he brings a kind of extraordinary blend of someone who thinks thematically, conceptually, but he also knows actually how to act on it. One of the things I often felt in Washington is that you would find people who embodied different kinds of characteristics. Some people could think about problems but had a hard time acting on them. Some people could think only tactically, operationally, and never had a real context in which to put it. And Jim was one of those people who was a pleasure to work with because he combined both. And I can hardly imagine someone more suited to be in a place like this than Jim Steinberg. So in the first instance, I have to say, it's nice to see all of you, but it's especially nice to see him. I can't help but start with a story, actually, about what it was like to deal with Assad because of what you said. there's an incredible array of different stories I could tell. But I'm not going to tell one that I tell in the book about negotiations. I'm going to tell one that describes more the mood of being in a meeting with him, but also what I felt at a particular moment. There was a time when we were meeting him, and it actually was on Yom Kippur, and I'm Jewish, so I had been fasting, and this was with Secretary Baker, and Margaret Tutwiler who was then his spokesperson, was very worried that I'd been fasting, and I had been fasting for, at this point, about 22 hours before we had actually gone to the meeting. And in the case of Assad there was always a particular approach to the meetings. It wasn't just that they were long. It's that food was never served, so that was not such a bad thing. But he would start with, there would be first orange juice or lemonade. This would be brought out in the first 15 minutes of the meeting. About an hour and a half later, they would bring coffee or tea. And then about an hour and a half later, there'd be water. And it always followed this pattern. Now, we're meeting in Damascus, and because this is a real fast, it means I'm not eating or drinking anything. And it was early in September, so it meant sundown didn't come till about 8:30, 8:45. And our meeting started at 6. We got called to go up there. The meeting starts at 6. So Margaret says to me, I'm really worried, should we have them cook things for you so they'll be ready when we come back? I said, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. So we get up there, and we're in the meeting, and Assad is very observant. At least he was always very observant. Couldn't be observant today, but he was very observant then, in ways his son is not, I can assure you. And he notes that every time they bring something to me, I'm not eating or drinking anything. Well, I'm not drinking anything. So for the first two things, he notes this, and I can see he notes it, and he's looking at me. And out of the blue, he says, well, we're all Christians, Muslims, and Jew here. And I go, and I know this is for my benefit, but it's also an indication. Assad was a stickler for detail, and he always wanted to know that you were a stickler for detail as well. So fast forward to another meeting. I mean, here was an example of him showing he was paying attention to me on something really minute. So I'm meeting him, first meeting I have with him after I become the envoy during the Clinton administration. And Assad has me see him in his vacation, his summer place, which is in Latakia. It's a California-style ranch setup, much nicer than the normal Damascus thing. So we've been meeting for about 5.5 hours. And suddenly he gets up and he walks out of the room. And he just disappears. And it's never happened before. So he comes back in and he sees that I'm looking at him with a kind of puzzled look on my face. And he says, do you remember the time that Baker had to take out his handkerchief and wave, meaning he had to go to the bathroom after about 7 hours? He says to me, I didn't have to do that. And I, of course, said, and this is sort of a lesson, actually, in leverage, I, of course, said, Mr. President, have you noticed that in all the years we've been meeting, I've never had to get up and leave? He goes, yes. I said, it's not because I've never had to go, it's just that I have an iron will. So he goes, that's very good, that's very good. Then he says to me, the other thing about you? I go, what's that? He says, you never forget a thing. And I said, well, I learned from you, Mr. President, that details are very important. He goes, no, you never forget a thing. So I said, well, I understand dealing with you, it's important to be on top of everything. He goes, no, you never forget a thing. I said, okay, you're right, I never forget a thing. At this point, he was content. And the essence of Assad was, negotiations were not give and take. They were attrition. Who could outlast whom? And the most interesting thing about Assad in the end, December 1999, he changes, and he wants to move very quickly. In fact, he says something remarkably and completely out of character. He says at one point he's in a hurry. This is a guy who always prided himself on never being in a hurry. One of the interesting things is we had a moment to do a deal, but it was a moment when Assad thought he was dying. Actually, obviously, he knew he was dying, and he was trying to prepare the ground for his son. Okay, so what does that have to do with statecraft? You're wondering? Well, statecraft obviously involves lots of different things. One thing it involves is leverage. Just like in negotiations, you don't get anything done if you don't have leverage. And if you're going to get something done when it comes to statecraft, you have to figure out where do you have leverage and where do those whose behavior you want to change, where do they have vulnerabilities? All right, so that's a setup for statecraft. Let me take a step back and ask you a question. How many here have heard the term statecraft before? How many here would feel confident they could define it? Of course, now the real reason you're not raising your hands is because you're afraid I'm going to call on you. Let me pose another question to you. We're in an academic setting. Let's imagine that we had an administration that was good at diplomacy. It's not an observation. I'm just posing a question, okay? You're reading into it. Correctly, but you're reading into it. All right. So let's imagine we have an administration that's good at diplomacy. We have an administration that is good at coercion, meaning it knows how to apply pressure directly or indirectly to affect the behavior of others. We have an administration that is good at using our economic wherewithal, again, for the purpose of affecting the behavior of others. We have an administration that is good at framing issues, meaning how they will talk about an issue or an objective with an eye towards being persuasive of others. The more effectively you frame issues publicly, the more others agree with what you want to do, the easier your task is going to be. And let's assume we have an administration that's good at intelligence. And by this I mean, not individually, collectively. Intelligence in terms of being able to identify threats and also opportunities. I do say in the book that timing is to statecraft what location is to real estate. When you have an opening and you miss it, you're worse off than if you didn't have an opening at all. So we have an administration that is good at all these different tools of the trade and knows how to orchestrate them and integrate them. Would this be an administration that's good at statecraft? What do you think? Yeah? Logical? Okay? Okay, let's assume this administration that is good at all these tools, good at integrating all these instruments, good at integrating all these assets, is pursuing all of these in the service of objectives that make no sense. Is an administration that's still good at statecraft? No. Flip it. What if you had an administration that was really good at identifying our purposes in the world, really good at identifying the right kinds of objectives that fit the circumstances, but was really bad at implementation? Would it be good at statecraft? Okay, so you've already learned lesson 1 on statecraft, haven't you? Good statecraft requires that you have purposes that make sense, but you can also implement them. Good statecraft requires that you have objectives that are clear, but they're married to your objectives. Good statecraft is always characterized by objectives and means that are in sync. Bad statecraft is always characterized by objectives and means that are basically divorced from each other. How would you say we're doing in Iraq? At the beginning of Iraq, it's obvious that we had a gap between objectives and means, right? Right? I mean, if you believe that our objectives were about WMD, well, we didn't have enough forces to go in and even be able to take control of all of the WMD sites that we suspected were WMD sites. So if WMD had actually been there, we wouldn't have been in a position to prevent it from being smuggled out of the country, because we didn't have enough forces. If our objective was to promote democracy, which the administration also, I think, suggests it was, well, we didn't have enough to create law and order so that you had a chance to build it. So either way, there was a huge gap between our objectives and our means. How about today? What do you think? Are we doing better on our objectives and our means in Iraq? Ah. So what is the objective? Does anybody here, could anybody here say clearly what they think the objective is? Does that...
Secure the oil fields.
Where? In the north? With the Kurds? In the south? With the Shia? One place to start in terms of trying to understand whether statecraft is being applied effectively is ask the question, well, how clear are the objectives? Pretty hard to marry objectives and means if you don't even have objectives that are very clear. If we go back and say, why did we have such a gap between our objectives and means when we went into Iraq? What's your guess? Sorry? Timing? Maybe. What else? Why else would we have had such a gap?
Lack of consensus on what we're doing.
A lack of consensus on what we were doing. What else? Not good intelligence?
Or lack thereof.
Lack of intelligence? All of these things are right, but I would offer one other explanation. To have good objectives and to have your objectives and your means basically related to each other, you have to have assessments that guide them. You have to have assessments that are reality-based, not faith-based. And when I say faith-based, I don't mean spirituality. I mean ideological blinders are attached so that the only thing you see is what your ideology allows you to see. Look at the assessment that the administration made, at least those who made the decisions. There was a fundamental premise that explained why we went in with the forces we did. Everything was going to fall into place when Saddam Hussein fell. It wasn't going to fall apart. Donald Rumsfeld's plan was to draw down from close to 160,000 troops to 25 to 30,000 troops in 3.5 months. Well, you wouldn't be drawn down unless everything's fallen into place, right? He didn't budget for forces beyond the 30,000 troops. So from basically March to the summer, we were going to draw down that way. Look at where General Petraeus is. To get down to the 30,000 troops we added, I'm not talking about going from 160 to 30,000. I'm talking about going from 160,000 to 130,000. He's going to take until next July. So there's no way you could be operating on an assumption except that everything's going to fall into place. Now, was it unknowable that we would face an insurgency? Was it unknowable that you might face a sectarian war? I don't think it was unknowable. So we had a faith-based assessment that guided us when we went in. All right, let's look at today. Are our objectives and means in sync, and are they, in a sense, being shaped by a reality-based assessment? What do you think? It's not a trick question. I mean, what do you think? I mean, are we doing better? Is there a reason to think we're doing better? The answer is no, from you. I mean, is there a collective sense that we're doing better or not? Is there a collective sense here that
Ask
you...
them to vote.
All right. I want to... Yeah.
Call on the people who see you. Ask them to vote.
All right, let's do it this way.
Who thinks it's
Everybody
better?
here who thinks that we now have objectives, I'm going to ask, better is a relative term. It's easy to say better. I'm going to drop that. I'm going to be very precise in the question. Do you think today we have a set of objectives in Iraq that are married to the means that we're using to achieve those objectives? How many people here think we do have that? Okay, we have one person only? How many people here think that we have objectives that are not somehow tied to our means? In a sense, we're still not getting it. And how many people are undecided? Okay. So, all right. Most people think there isn't a marriage between objectives and means. All right, I'm going to offer my own assessment now, which is going to come as a shock to Jim. Let's start by saying, what is the surge? Is the surge a means or an objective? It's a means. Now, in January, when the surge was announced, the objective that the president spelled out was an objective that the surge was supposed to create a secure enough environment in Baghdad so that the different sectarian leaders would no longer fear or have reason to fear that they could negotiate compromises between themselves and forge a new national compact. In a sense, the surge was a means designed to create an environment where they could produce a political solution for Iraq. Now, one thing we already know, that objective hasn't been achieved, and we have a new objective that's been defined by the administration last month. The new objective is no longer national reconciliation from the center. The new objective is local empowerment. We're going to build, instead of from the top down, we're going to build a new Iraq from the bottom up. And local empowerment is basically the vehicle. Now, the surge is the military means to produce this. The local empowerment will create a different Iraq over time. And what did the president say? The president said, I'm quoting him now, he said, as local politics change, national politics will change. Those are his words. So here again, I think we have to say, all right, is that based on reality, or is it still based more on hope? Well, let's take a closer look. Today in Baghdad, we have created an environment that is more secure than it was, and how are we doing it? Well, we're doing it with presence on the ground, and we're also building separation walls. Separation walls to separate every one of the sectarian neighborhoods. So local empowerment there isn't exactly creating some sort of agreement there. In Anbar province, we've created local empowerment. Why? Well, because we have the Sunni tribes who are fighting al-Qaeda. In Diyala province, the same thing. What we have right now is, in a sense, a strategy that is based on building from the ground up, but we have only military means that we're applying. We don't have a political strategy. You're going to have to create, between the local areas, some kind of political linkage. If not, we will have to be a referee. Because everybody we empower at the local level, sooner or later, they're going to bump up to those who are next to them. And if there aren't agreements between the two of them, we're going to have to referee it. In Baghdad, in Baghdad, what we're doing is creating separation walls, because we're not creating that link. The separation walls take the place of us being the referee. In the provinces, we're basically going to have to be in a position where if we're not going to be the referee, we're actually going to have to create some kind of political connection. So today we have military means in service of an objective that can only be achieved with political means. So we still have a gap. Too much talking. All right, so let's take this a step further. Are there a set of political means that could be employed? Is there an objective that we could be pursuing that's different than local empowerment that offers us a way out? What do you think? Is it hopeless in Iraq today?
I've got a question about assessments.
Go ahead.
In the middle of a chaotic situation, how do we as consumers of those assessments are trying to figure out what the gap is between objectives and means? How do you look at an assessment and decide that it's based on credible data when you're in an admittedly chaotic environment?
Well, first of all, you try to gather all the material you can. I mean, the key in a place like Iraq, you got to take it from as many different sources as you can. And if you're going to make certain assumptions that things are working out, then you're going to have to look for different sources to prove, in some cases from places you might not expect, that what you believe is in fact being validated. You look at what's going on today in Iraq. You know, why is it that the Shia-led government was okay with what was going on in Anbar province and Diyala province? Because Sunnis were killing Sunnis. And it was a long ways away. Suddenly, when you start doing the same thing in Baghdad, it doesn't look so good. The United Iraqi Alliance, the largest single Shia grouping, the biggest part of the government, what's their position on the local empowerment now? On the development of these auxiliary forces? They came out and very harshly criticized it last week, made it clear they're against it. Our problem right now today in Iraq is, in a sense, the only strategy we have is based upon military means. There is no political strategy. There is no set of political means that are being used in any systematic way. So let's take a look at Iraq from the following perspective. What should our objective be right now? And given what that objective should be, what are the means we have available to try to pursue it? Well, I would tell you if you asked me, and I was asked, I mean, I am on a book tour, so I'm going all around. I was asked a question last week. What will Iraq look like in 10 years? And I said, if you give me 10 or 15 years, I'll tell you that it will have a central government with very limited power. It will have provinces with very extensive autonomy. Now, the autonomy, in some cases, will break down along sectarian lines. In other cases, it'll be more tribal lines. Bear in mind one thing. 4 million people out of 26 million people have been displaced. In this country, that would be the equivalent of 45 million people being displaced. That is so catastrophic that you can't even comprehend it in terms of how disruptive it is, in terms of the legacy that it basically conveys. So what I'm suggesting is that we will probably see a central government that still exists but with very limited powers. We will probably see provinces with very extensive autonomy, and we will probably see some means to share revenues. Now, you'll get there in one of two ways, either through sheer exhaustion, where they'll fight it out, and eventually you'll come to some understanding based on exhaustion, that there's a consensus enough already. Now, that could be what's most likely to happen. There is an alternative to that. The alternative to that is what I would call a managed transition. A managed transition to get to that point. I have to tell you frankly, I'm not optimistic that we'll be able to do it at this point. Too much has happened. But I think it's worth testing. Now, because I'm not optimistic, my managed transition would be my preferred objective. My fallback objective would be containment. Now, by containment, I mean basically what's in Iraq stays in Iraq. It's what I call the Las Vegas rules for Iraq. Works for everybody but O.J. Simpson. So containment is where you want to fall back to, but containment still poses terrible dilemmas for us. Why? We have an array of different positions today on Iraq in the political scene. If you look at the top 3 Democratic candidates, none of them in their last debate were prepared to say that by 2013 we wouldn't still have troops within Iraq. President Bush himself is saying he's going to withdraw because success is going to make withdrawal possible. So we have a spectrum here on withdrawal that is a pretty wide spectrum. The point is, at this juncture, we have to try to focus on how do we achieve a managed transition at all, but how do we ensure that we can fall back to what is, in fact, containment if we can't achieve the former. So the real question is, if those are the objectives, what are the means that we might use? And the reason, by the way, that I say that containment is a fallback objective is any kind of withdrawal runs the risk of some kind of bloodbath. Because every time we withdraw, if you don't work out a political arrangement where you withdraw from, the potential is that boundaries will be defined through violence. If we have forces that are still there, you're going to end up in a situation where we have forces sitting on the sideline watching as you see what could be a lot of bloodletting. But while that may not be satisfying, you may not be able to achieve a managed transition. So again, I come back and I say managed transition as your preferred objective, containment as your fallback objective. Now, how would I go about trying to marry objectives with means? Maybe I should go on to Iran. I won't. I would say there's 3 means that I would try to apply to achieve these objectives. Again, this is all from the perspective of a statecraft approach that marries objectives and means, and I've just given you kind of my reality-based assessment. First, we've never applied leverage in this situation. I would use withdrawal as a lever. One of the things I would do is I would say, look, everybody knows we're going to withdraw, but how we withdraw can be influenced by what, in fact, local Iraqis do. So I would say those who cooperate with each other, we're going to benefit. We will approach withdrawal in terms of timing, pace, character, nature, we'll approach withdrawal the way you want us to approach withdrawal. And by the way, it doesn't just mean that we'll benefit you that way. We'll benefit you in terms of material, military, and economic. So those who are prepared to cooperate within Iraq, with each other, they'll get the benefit because we'll approach withdrawal the way they want us to. A variation of this is I actually, a year ago, suggested to the administration that they not impose a timetable, but declare that they would negotiate a timetable with the Iraqis, which means that the Iraqis would have an input into it, but also means that the lever of withdrawal would be there. The administration was able to restrain their enthusiasm for that proposal, along with many other of my proposals. And if they wouldn't do that now, then I would at least use withdrawal as a lever. So that's means number one. Means number two, we have never had a reconciliation conference in Iraq that would meet for more than a day. Maliki has organized 3 such reconciliation meetings, and they all meet for a day. Now, as a veteran of negotiations in this part of the world, I can tell you it takes at least a day for people just to say hello. So the idea that you would convene for a day and then disband, these are photo ops. They're not serious efforts to produce anything. I might not even use the term reconciliation now, I might say a political accommodation conference, or I'd come up with some title, but it would not be allowed to disband until they reached agreement. And this would be an effort to draw on the need to create political links between the different actors. Now, since we're engaged in local empowerment, which is what the surge is all about, I would obviously include people from the local areas, including those who we're empowering. I would include those from the provincial areas as well, and from the national, from the center. So the second means, after using withdrawal as a lever, would be some kind of national reconciliation, national accommodation conference that cannot be allowed to disband until, in fact, they've reached agreement or not. Now, I mean, again, the way you do this, you'd set up an agenda first, you'd focus on how you organize the conference and so forth, and maybe we're not the best ones to do it at this point, but maybe we could get the UN or others involved in doing this. I would still have us do it. I mean, I feel it's important for us to do it, but that's a second means. A third means, this one relates more to what I call the containment fallback option. We're doing something right now with Iran on Iraq that makes absolutely no sense to me. We are negotiating bilaterally with Iran on Iraq. Now, I'll ask you what is obviously a rhetorical question, having telegraphed my question in advance. Can anybody here think of why Iran would want to pull our chestnuts out of the fire in Iraq? You know, they might want to pull their own chestnuts out of the fire, but they're not going to pull ours out of the fire. And if you actually look at what Petraeus has been saying last week and when he was in Washington, since we began the bilateral negotiations with Iran on Iraq, Iranian behavior has become worse, not better. Not a surprise. Yeah, there's a chapter in the book on 12 rules on how to negotiate. Well, you know, when you're in a negotiating situation, you want leverage. Well, when it comes to Iraq, the Iranians have leverage on us, not the other way around. But you know what? Iran might be prepared to pull their own chestnuts out of the fire in Iraq. You know, people tend to forget that Iran is 50% Persian, which means, by the way, that it's 50% not Persian. They are Kurds, they are Azeris, they are Arab, they are Baluch. The last thing they want is a real vacuum within Iraq. In fact, the last thing any of Iraq's neighbors want is a real vacuum in Iraq, because if there is, they all rush in to compete with each other, and they get sucked into something that is basically an endless competition and quite expensive. Now, the truth is, we don't want that either. When I talk about containment, I don't want convulsion in Iraq spilling over and causing a convulsion in the region. But here again, there is some built-in leverage. The Iraqis wanted the creation of a regional conference on Iraq, which created a nice umbrella for actually focusing on how you might be brokering understandings between the neighbors. Of course, this too met for a day, I think twice. We ought to be focused on how could we broker understandings between the neighbors. I'm not so focused on us reaching an understanding with Iran on Iraq. I mean, I actually would engage them, but on a whole array of issues, not just Iraq. But I think the fact is the Iranians are quite aware that Saudi Arabia is prepared to finance forever the Sunni tribes. And by the way, they don't have a cash flow problem. And the Iranians, understanding that, have a certain stake in maybe reaching an understanding with the Saudis. The Saudis have an understanding in wanting certain limitations in terms of what the Iranians will do in Iran, in Iraq, or not do in Iraq. So the idea of trying to broker something among the neighbors is something that ought to be explored. Now, I'm not confident that they will agree on what they want for Iraq, but I am confident that they at least have some possibility of agreeing on what they fear could happen in Iraq. And that is linked to the notion of containment. So in a sense, what I'm offering you is two sets of objectives, a preferred one and a fallback one, and three different means for how to pursue them. Not, by the way, independent of the surge. Surge is going to go on, and it's a military means. The problem with it, though, as I said, there is no vehicle today to transform what we're trying to do into a political outcome. There was a story, I don't know if you saw it, I think 2 days ago in the Washington Post, a very long story that talked about, national reconciliation isn't going to work. And even some of the strongest proponents of it within Iraq, Barham Saleh, who's a deputy prime minister, who's a Kurd, who's actually a wonderful man, someone I've known for some time. And he had been sort of the leading light of trying to produce something along these lines. He says, well, maybe what we ought to focus on now is effective governance. I mean, the fact is, today, if you don't come up with a political means to parallel your military means, then you have little prospect of succeeding. But here again, you better focus on your objective. I asked earlier, what's the administration's objective? I'll tell you what the administration's objective is as they describe it. They say to be able to get the Iraqis to the point where they can handle their own security. And I would ask you the question, which Iraqis? So for me, a statecraft approach to Iraq it's not too late for it, but it's pretty late. And I wish I could be more optimistic about the preferred objective. I'm much more fearful that containment is where we're going to end up. But given some of the dilemmas we'd be confronted with, I would want to go for something more than that. Now, obviously, I'm capable of speaking for long periods of time. That actually goes with the territory of being a negotiator. If you're a negotiator or mediator, there's lots of times where basically, to ensure you don't have a food fight, you fill the vacuum. And as Jim knows, I can fill vacuums better than anybody. So I could continue to do that, but I really don't want to. I want this to be more of a dialogue than a monologue. So let me just offer one last concluding thought to explain actually why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because I was looking at this administration and I became increasingly disquieted by what I saw. Statecraft was being used as a slogan, not as a real concept. It wasn't just that I never saw the marriage of objectives and means. Rarely did I see the effort to define objectives in a clear enough way to understand them, and I almost never saw any serious framing of issues or explanation of issues. So I decided that if we have any hope of trying to restore America's standing in the world, we're going to have to actually restore statecraft to the conduct of American foreign policy. Now, I wrote the book by design so it would come out in 2007. Obviously, I was looking at 2008. I was looking at the idea that when we have a campaign where we have 2 candidates as opposed to 20, I want to try to, and one of the reasons I'm on what I can only describe as the endless book tour, I wanted to be out speaking all around the country, and I mean, if there's a World Affairs Council that I'm not hitting, I don't know which one it is. It's true I'm not doing Anchorage, but it's probably not too late for that. I want basically to be addressing this, raising this in a way where I create enough discussion about it that maybe next year, when we actually have a campaign where you have 2 candidates and clear questions can be posed, when they're asked questions on foreign policy and they're asked about objectives, the objectives aren't described at a level of 40,000 feet. And when they're asked to describe objectives, whether it's on Iraq or it's on Iran or it's on China or whatever it is, the response is clear enough, and when they're asked what about means, they actually begin to do it. So I want to create enough buzz about the concept that the term itself becomes understood again, and that we have a chance for the next administration to embody it in the work of foreign policy, which is the second reason I wrote it. The second reason I wrote it was because, and Jim knows this very well, every administration has a legacy, and this one isn't just the policy that it's going to pass on to whoever comes in 2009. There's also sociology, because there are a lot of people who are in the continuing bureaucracy who have been a part of how this administration has reached decisions and how it acts on the decisions. And so part of my purpose is to address them. I want the candidates to be able to internalize it, but I want those who are part of the continuing government to have a sense of it. So I actually speak a fair amount about this in Washington as well. Now there's a third and last reason, not why I wrote the book, but why I'm on the Endless Book Tour. And this is an ex post facto development. This is Walter Mearsheimer. Walter Mearsheimer, I don't know how many people of you are familiar with the book that they've written, but their book is basically, in my mind, it's foreign policy through conspiracy. It's a monocausal explanation for our foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East. Much like the Bush administration, they fix on an ideology, and they never let reality intrude, because it might spoil the theory. They're critics of the Bush administration, but the answer to the Bush administration isn't basically to adopt an equally wrong-headed, simple-minded approach to things. So my answer is, statecraft is not, or foreign policy isn't a function of conspiracy. Foreign policy is a function of doing statecraft well or doing it badly. Unfortunately, we know what the verdict is for this administration. Okay, I'll stop there and take some questions.
Thank you, Darren. I hope all of you here, especially Elspeth and my students, know that this discussion about defining your objectives and the means to achieve them is not relevant just to policymakers, but also people writing policy memos and policy courses. Think about it, objectives and means, right? Very important. Des, I'm going to ask the first question. I'll ask you to lift your sights a little, both geographically and temporally. We've been talking a lot about the Middle East in our class, and you could argue that for 40 years from the founding of Israel and after World War II, that the Middle East was a chessboard between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was kind of the dominant fact. Soviet Union disappears for at least 10 years. The dominant fact is that the United States is the dominant power. It's shaping the dialogue, the debate, and things. You started it at Madrid. It carried on through the Clinton administration. What's next? Is there now an opportunity to extend that so that we get back to the place where the United States is the kind of the center of gravity focal point, or if things change so much because of Iraq and other forces that there's going to be a new dynamic in the broader Middle East, not just Iraq, but the Levant and the broader region?
It's a really, not surprisingly, excellent question with no simple answer. Again, let's take a step back and try to look at what's going on in the region. What are the new developments? Well, one new development is the perception of us and the ineffective use of American power. I mean, one thing about this part of the world, power matters. I mean, Osama bin Laden said he wanted to be the man on the white horse. He wanted to be the guy. He wanted to be the strong guy. Power does matter. Power implemented very badly, unfortunately, also has its own set of consequences. So there's a perception of us today that we're ineffective. What I don't know, and I go to the region fairly often, what I don't know is how deeply rooted that is and how difficult it will be to reverse that without some demonstration of effectiveness. I do have a suspicion that if we could begin to show that we're more effective, there isn't anybody who can easily replace us. There's no one else who comes in to fill that vacuum, and yet there still is a need, because the issue of security and stability still shapes the outlook of most of the regimes in the area. So that's point one. Point two, there is a Sunni-Shia divide that is part of the landscape now. It's part of the consequence of Iraq. We, not by design, but through inadvertence, have basically helped to sharpen this divide. It's gone through different phases, but it's fairly acute right now. One of the things that led the Secretary of State to want to focus on why she's doing the Arab-Israeli diplomacy is that she thought that there was a strategic transformation. She used the word strategic transformation to say she looked at the Saudis, she looked at the Israelis, she saw the Egyptians, saw the Jordanians, saw the Moroccans, and said, gee, they're all afraid of Iran. And because they share that threat perception, we have a transformation. Now again, it's nice, just not true. We have an opening. To make it a transformation, you have to basically turn an opening into a transformation. The reason it's not a transformation is the Saudis take a look at Hamas and they say they're Sunni. Why should they be aligned with Iran? We can wean them away. Turns out not to be so easy. So the point here is the Sunni-Shia divide is going to be a kind of reference point in terms of local competition. to the extent to which we are seen as a problem, you're going to see greater disassociation from us. Some of that's happening now. Look at Saudi behavior over the last 6 months. It's actually quite stunning if you list what they have done in response to us. I mean, I won't do the full litany, but I just want to cite 2 examples just to put this into some perspective. The first is we badly wanted the Saudis to be much more helpful in Iraq, which they have not been. We asked them not only to forgive the previous debt, but we asked them also to receive Maliki when he went to Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah wouldn't see him, but he would see Ahmadinejad when he came to Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah, when he was hosting the Arab League meeting, described the occupation in Iraq, our occupation in Iraq, as an illegitimate occupation, his words, which in this part of the world is a code word for saying resistance is okay. So since a lot of those who happen to be going across the border into Iraq happen to be Saudis and are funded by Saudis, you know, hardly something that we should have been prepared to welcome. And by the way, our response to it was, we disagree. Wow, that's impressive. You know, you're trying to impress others about, there's a consequence in terms of how you behave towards us. Well, that's hardly the way to do it. So it is a reference point. Now, trying to exploit it too much, I think, can backfire on us. On the other hand, not understanding it and not searching for those in the Middle East who, in a sense, are on both sides of the divide, who don't want it to blow up into a full-scale, ongoing conflict in the region. And they do exist. That should be part of, I think, what we're doing. So I guess my long-winded answer to you, which is not a complete answer, I think the world has changed in the Middle East, but I don't think it's irredeemable because we still offer something that no one else does. There still is a need that we represent. And what will influence this, which is the one thing I didn't mention, is what happens if Iran goes nuclear. Because then the tendency is to, on the one hand, yes, want some protection from us, but also a strong impulse to accommodate. So I think how that ends up being handled will influence a lot basically the landscape of the region and our role and place in it.
How about?
Ambassador, first of all, thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
We appreciate that. You mentioned the Waltz and Marsheimer book.
Yeah.
In that book, you figure pretty prominently. I don't think it's a secret that, you know, aside from your distinguished diplomatic career, you've also been a participant in what people have referred to as the Israel lobby. You have been an executive at AIPAC.
No, I have not.
Well, it's...
I mean, one thing people should get is their facts right.
All right, well...
That's a pretty good starting point.
Maybe there's a rumor that you've been... but you work for the Washington Institute.
That's
and
true.
Very recently, you've been advocating for the release of Jonathan Pollard, the American spy, even though the CIA and the National Security Council opposed it pretty strongly. Now, not being conspirational, but that seems to me, you know, that if you come as a role as a negotiator and someone who's trying to, you know, negotiate American policy in the Middle East, that it's just a basic issue of conflict of interest. I mean, how do you know, negotiate that?
Sure. Well, first, being Jewish doesn't disqualify you from being a negotiator, number one.
Right.
Second, the fact is, I did negotiate for a long time, and I'm one of the few people who actually had credibility with both sides. One of the problems with Walton Mearsheimer, by the way, they didn't bother to interview anybody who made policy. Maybe had they done that, they'd actually understand how policy is made. You know, they make a couple of points. One is that we went to Iraq because of the Israeli lobby. Well, you know, if Al Gore had won the presidency, we wouldn't have gone to Iraq, and yet he had a long history with the Israeli lobby. George Bush didn't. So you tell me, their words they use are the primary driver. Well, if in fact you had a different president and we wouldn't be there, it suggests that there's a different causation for why we're there. Something else they say is our approach on settlement policy, Israeli settlement policy, was a function of the Israeli lobby. Simply untrue. In the first Bush administration, of which I was a part, and actually, you know, probably the leading conceptualizer of what we did, we actually didn't provide the Israelis loan guarantees, the $10 billion loan guarantees, even though this was pretty fundamental to the Israelis, especially at the time when the Soviet Union had opened the floodgates to Jewish immigration. And we didn't do it because President Bush's position was that we didn't want the loan guarantees to lead to increased settlement activity. So we wanted a set of assurances from the Shamir government which they weren't prepared to provide. So we didn't provide it, and Shamir lost the election. When Rabin came in, we actually negotiated a deal where there was a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the loan guarantees. For every dollar Israel spent on settlement activity, they lost $1 of the loan guarantees. So that was hardly, you know, and by the way, you know who negotiated that deal? That was me. So they don't really tend to get their facts straight because they don't really look at why policy is made. When the Clinton administration came in, on the issue of settlements, basically we made a judgment completely separate from the Israeli lobby. What was the judgment? Rabin said to us he was prepared to go very far, but he faced enormous pressure if he did too much cutting back on settlement activity. Now, the fact that he was assassinated by somebody who came out of the settler, nationalist, religious constituency suggests that he might have known something that he was talking about. We took into account what his position was. With Barak, we did the same thing. Barak said, I'm going to get out of most of the territory. Don't push me on the settlement issue prematurely because if I have to act on it, it'll deny me the political capital I need for later on when I want to do a deal. We listened to him. Now, you can disagree with that judgment. Even I have said publicly, you know, I think we made a mistake because the issue of settlements was something that in the end, as the continued building went on, Palestinians were made to feel powerless. And when you're made to feel powerless, guess what? It's going to produce a reaction. So I think we weren't right. But the reason we made it, the judgment, was because something you do in negotiations with both sides. You take into account what both sides tell you about what they can do and what they can't do. And you make a judgment. We made a judgment. The reason we made the judgment was because of what we heard. It wasn't because of the Israeli lobby. You know, I'm the author, the principal author of the Clinton ideas, in which we would divide Jerusalem. You think the Israeli lobby favored the idea of dividing Jerusalem? Hardly. But you wouldn't know that from reading the Walter Mearsheimer book, because they have a theory, and they don't let reality intrude into the theory. You know, have I had a special relationship with Israel? Yes. But, you know, I'll tell you a story. I gave a speech in Gaza when you could still go to Gaza. And this was shortly before the election in which Hamas won. And in the speech I was speaking to between 300 and 400 people, and all the leaders, by the way, of Hamas were there. And the speech was sponsored by the Palestinian Council on Foreign Relations, and the guy who ran it was a guy named Ziad Abu Amr, who was foreign minister for a brief time in the National Unity Government. And he organized a one-day conference where the people who spoke in the morning was the Russian negotiator representing Russia, and then the EU negotiating representing the EU. Because the U.S. didn't have a negotiator, he invited me. I think the last time we had one. And in the morning, the Russian gave a speech that basically no Palestinian there couldn't have given. And then the EU representative happens to be a good guy. Gave a speech, but he didn't really challenge the audience very much. And the response from the audience to both of them was to basically complain about the U.S. The U.S. isn't an honest broker. So I got up and I said, you know, I'm going to say some things that you're not going to like. You're going to say some things I'm not going to like, but we're both going to have a better understanding of each other at the end of this. First, let's start with a principle. You don't want an honest broker. The Europeans and the Russians, from your standpoint, would be much more honest brokers because they're more sympathetic to you. So you don't want an honest broker, you want a sympathetic broker. Now let's look at the U.S. The U.S., under the Bush administration, because they've been in for over 4 years at this point, I said under the Bush administration, they haven't been a broker at all. Are you better off? This was an audience that hadn't been shy at all in terms of sounding off. When I said, are you better off with the U.S. for the last 4 years not having been a broker at all? And by the way, not having prevented the Russians or the Europeans from being a broker? Are you better off? No one was prepared to say they were better off. I said, you need the U.S. as a broker. What you want is an effective broker. Now, you can't be a broker unless you take into account the needs of both sides. When we did the Clinton parameters, the Clinton ideas in December, these were unprecedented. And by the way, they'll make up eventually, if we ever have a deal, the essence of the Clinton ideas will be the essence of what the deal is, plus or minus. Now, who did it? Those who were sympathetic to the Israelis? Yes. Because if you believe in peace and you believe that peace is an option, you have to come up with an approach that takes into account the needs of both sides, not of one side. So my answer, long-winded though it might be to you, is that, yeah, I have a Jewish identity. And I would tell you it's probably too bad that there wasn't someone like me in the Bush administration who actually had a passion for the issue. One of the things I say in the book, in the chapter on mediation, the notion that mediators should be dispassionate is presented by those who've never had to mediate a high-stakes conflict. Because the rule of thumb of those conflicts is setback, not progress. And if you don't believe in it, you'll give up. So it actually helps to bring a passion to it. But the passion can't mislead you into not being prepared to understand and hear both sides in terms of what they need. Yeah.
Is there anyone, back in the World War I era, there was an advisor to the British named Gertrude Bell, who was very steeped in knowledge of the individual tribes and played quite a role in helping to draw the boundaries of Iraq.
Right.
Is there somebody today that is anywhere near being involved in trying to help sort and assess and set objectives, who has that level of understanding of the various cultures on the ground?
There's been an awful lot written about Gertrude Bell. She brought a particular passion to the area as well. And the notion that you could simply redraw the map and create a country called Iraq out of a place that had never had such a history isn't necessarily something that you would necessarily want to replicate right now.
Right.
Are there people who know the area really well? Yeah, you bet there are.
Are they involved?
They're not with this administration.
Yeah.
I see no evidence of it. It's not, look, someone like Ryan Crocker, by the way, who is the ambassador, he knows this part of the world really well. I've known Ryan Crocker since 1980. So, I mean, is he steeped in this? Yes. But you need, for something like this, it's not just an individual, you need a team. You know what, in a sense, if you listen to what I was suggesting, I was in effect saying you need 3 parallel negotiations on withdrawal and how you exploit it as a lever, on accommodation or reconciliation and political bridge building, and on brokering between the neighbors. Now that takes a high level of involvement by people who actually have some experience being mediators. This administration basically doesn't mediate. I mean, they just don't do it. So, and in your 7th year of an administration, you do develop a way that you do business. So, do they have access to people who will tell them what they think should be done and who know the area? Yeah. Look, the president did a review before he adopted the surge. It isn't just that you had the Iraq study group that came in with their study. He called in lots of people. But in the end, everything was seen through a particular set of parameters that defined in a very limited way what the choices could be. And that the choices were defined in a way that we weren't getting out. Okay. If you ask me, I said if you ask me what the administration's real objective is today, it's basically to get through the end of the administration and then leave the problem for the next administration. That's what I think the real objective is today. Now, I don't mean to say they don't want something good to happen in Iraq. Of course they do. But the fact is, listen to what Petraeus and Ryan Crocker have said. They both said it's going to take a lot of time, that you're not going to have any quick turnaround. Well, that I would say is realistic. But if you look at what we're doing, you can't find a parallel political strategy to the strategy using the surge. I didn't say I was against the surge. I said the surge can't be an end in itself, and it can't be the only means you're employing. I'm afraid whoever is the next president will inherit as their first preoccupation Iraq. They will inherit at least 100,000 troops. I actually had a discussion last week with a Republican friend of mine. He thinks that when Petraeus comes in March, that's when Bush no longer will be able to manage the Republican base on the Hill. And I said to him, what I was hearing from a lot of your Republican colleagues was that's what was going to happen this September. And I said to him, you know what I suspect? I suspect that somehow we'll have a new prime minister emerge before next March in Iraq, and the new line is going to be, you got to give him a chance. So, you know, it's not that it's dishonest. I think the truth is they want to try to create the best possible thing in Iraq. But they talk so much to themselves. This is one of the problems with this administration is groupthink. And within the narrow confines of the groupthink, you basically exclude a lot of possibilities. So it isn't that they're not talking to people who understand the region, but they're picking out of what they say what they want to hear. And they dismiss the part that they don't want to hear because it doesn't fit what the options are for what they're prepared to do.
Let me, it's partially my problem here, which is I've got to go on represent us at the NASPA conference in Seattle, and I've got to catch a plane. So I'll sort of call an end to the formal part of the session and thank Dennis, but he may have a few more minutes to chat with you all informally. But okay. Again, on behalf of all of us, Dennis, thank you.